And our next two sessions, which we'll be sending out registration links for this afternoon on May 7th from 2 to 3 p.m. We will be having a presentation on the advancements and of habitat suitability modeling and how we can use them to leverage conservation outcomes. We'll hear from Regan Smythe from NatureServe and a few network partners from the US and Canada about how they're using models and range maps for their conservation efforts. And on May 14th, we'll have a panel on various snapshots of ranking assessments that have been done around the network. So we'll hear from 4 folks from around the network, US and Canada, on recent efforts in species and ecosystems rankings. So look for those emails, register for those webinars, and we'll see you there next week. Some Zoom logistics for everyone. So this is in webinar mode, so all attendees are muted and video is turned off. We do have over 100 people now on the webinar, so I'll ask that any questions you have in the chat box, which should be in your tools at the bottom of your screen. You can chat to, I would say, chat to all attendees and panelists so everyone can see your message. So at any time, put your questions in there and we will get them. We do have a couple of spots planned in the agenda to pause and answer some questions. And so, but feel free to put them in there anytime throughout the session today. We are recording this session, just so you're aware. All of the chat, all of the audio and visual will be recorded, and we will make the video available on our website once this session is over. So with that, hopefully everyone is logged on now, and I'm going to turn it over to Rick Schneider, who's going to moderate this session.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. It's my pleasure today to introduce the two speakers. Jon Ambrose is the Chief of Wildlife Conservation Section at the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. And as a number of you know, he was formerly the director for the Georgia Natural Heritage Program. And Jon currently oversees the development and implementation of the Georgia State Wildlife Action Plan. And Georgia was one of a handful of states who included plants as species of greatest conservation need in their original SWAP back in 2005. And in his portion of the presentation today, he'll be focusing on the plants and RAWA sort of aspect. And then Naomi Edelson is the Senior Director of Wildlife Partnerships at the National Wildlife Federation. And she also has a bit of a heritage connection. Back in the 80s, she worked for the Maine Critical Areas Program, which collaborated with the Maine Natural Heritage Program. And she discovered one of the first documented populations of world begonia in the state. So a botany background as well. And just prior to working for the National Wildlife Federation, she was the Teaming with Wildlife Director and the Wildlife Diversity Director at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And in her role there, she led the campaign for the successful passage of the legislation which currently provides state wildlife grants. So I think the entire conservation community has a debt of gratitude for Naomi's incredible work there. She had a great technique for getting access to members of Congress. She would roam the halls of Congress with a live bald eagle in store, and no politician could resist a photo op with a bald eagle. So she had great access. And as you'll see today, she also is still very much involved in trying to see through the successful passage of the Recovery America's Wildlife Act. So Naomi, it's all yours.
Okay, great. Are the picture, I'm going to switch over to this screen so I can see it, but so I'll be, it looks like I'm looking up, but I'm actually looking at just a different computer. But thank you all, or maybe I'll stick with this one. Thank you all very much. First of all, Rick and Allison and NatureServe for continuing to let this presentation happen. I was really looking forward to being in Richmond. It's a fun city, and I was looking forward to being at the NatureServe meeting. So I appreciate that you pivoted to still providing an opportunity for people to share information and have some feedback and discussion. And we've always, myself, when I worked at AFWA and then continuing at National Wildlife Federation, we've had a very good partnership with NatureServe, and I really appreciate that too for the long term that we've had. I will just say, just like everybody else, I'm working from home. I have told my husband and son not to come in, but I can't control the dog completely. So hopefully there will be no dog barking, but just a little bit of a warning. She decides to bark at everybody who comes within a few feet of our house. So that might happen. So I'm pleased to be able to talk with you about Recovering America's Wildlife Act. I know many of you know a lot about it. I want to talk through what's in the bill. And as part of that, I'll turn it over to Jon Ambrose, who obviously has a long history in this effort as well. And he and the Georgia DNR in particular has provided a lot of leadership. And he will talk specifically about the plant aspect. And that's when we'll stop and we'll have some discussion. And then we'll go back to the campaign part of it and what is the sort of state of play on the Hill, and how those of you who wish to engage and can engage either as a private citizen or through your organization or agency, how you might help in the campaign. So then we'll stop again for question and answers. I'm going to try this so I don't have to look always at two. So the National Wildlife Federation, I hope most of you know, is an organization that is 80 plus years old. We started with, we were started by Ding Darling, and we are very focused on conserving wildlife, their habitats, and the broad array of outdoor enthusiasts who enjoy the outdoors. We have affiliates in pretty much every state, minus a couple, and we also do in the territories. Some of you might know them, like Nebraska Wildlife Federation, Georgia Wildlife Federation are obvious, but we also have some without the name federation in there. Recovering America's Wildlife Act, I'm going to see if I can move that, is a bill in Congress with the focus on being a proactive conservation solution that will prevent wildlife from becoming endangered in every single state. It is dedicated funding, meaning that it is considered out of the regular budget process. It's not subject to annual appropriations, meaning you don't have to fight for it every year. And the funds can be used for proactive, collaborative conservation efforts for species at risk. The way the bill is set up, it's actually $1.3 billion a year that would go back to state fish and wildlife agencies, and then about another $100 million for tribes, which has been a new part of this bill compared with previous efforts, which we're really pleased to see and we're strong advocates for. I know, again, you all know you're very invested in conserving our nation's natural heritage. So, you know the story of the monarch decline, and that's a very good example of species that are at risk of becoming endangered. But of course, there are many more, and we have estimated, there's estimation, based on a lot of your work, of at least a third of the species at risk of extinction. And many are already endangered. And state wildlife action plans have identified really more than 13,000 species of greatest conservation need. And as we'll talk about, that number is actually much higher because not all of the state wildlife action plans include plants. One of some of the most notable figures to really talk about this widespread problem out there, which sometimes we call the quiet crisis, is that, but the science article that came out that showed we've lost since 1970, 2.9 billion individual birds. And for something as common as the eastern meadowlark, we've lost 3 in 4. And I think this really woke up a lot of people to how bad the decline is. People have often focused on a few species that are really critically endangered, but this shows it's much more than just those that we hear about on the endangered species list. Some good examples are the cerulean warbler, which has seen a 74% decline, very dramatic. And we published a report working with the American Fisheries Society and the Wildlife Society that shows all 50 states have these declines in all groups of wildlife. Some examples: 42% of salamanders, and again, as I'm sure you know, that salamanders are important globally. The United States holds one of the most important populations of them, and if we lose them, it's a significant loss for the world. That's also true with freshwater mussels, and many of them are already extinct, and of course, many imperiled and have been the focus of a lot of agency efforts to reintroduce them. Also, greater than a huge number of freshwater fish, typically the smaller, darters and other kinds of fish, are at risk. Bats, and we know, and what I need here is a slide for plants. So maybe somebody can help me put that one in. And what we know, of course, is that there are many different reasons why we're having the loss, and it's a cumulative impact often of all of these, and they're very related to each other and exacerbated by each other and so on. So we know there's many more in the pipeline. The solution, and we've known this for quite a while, but is that we really need to basically take proactive efforts before they need the emergency room measures of the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act is critically important, and we absolutely have to defend it. But we need something that is funded and work is done way before it gets to that point, when we have a lot more opportunity, both biologically and also economically. Some really good examples of proactive conservation are examples, again, of habitat restoration and acquisition, surveys, research on threats. It could be as simple as not so simple, but invasive species removal, and disease detection and eradication, as well as species reintroduction. Some really good examples of species reintroductions that have been successful and that have captured a lot of positive attention. It's the kind of thing that people are very happy to learn about and support. Here's a picture actually of my son when he was little, reintroducing some fish into my nearby Sligo Creek, right in Montgomery County, Maryland, right outside it on the DC line. We know that we can have a positive impact over decades when people have, efforts, biologists have returned species that they've had tremendous success. Not in all cases, but enough cases that we can say it can happen. With the it's actually almost the 20th anniversary of the state wildlife grants that Rick mentioned, and those, of course, created the state wildlife action plans. These plans are what have identified species, habitats, and the actions needed to sustain them, where that number of 12,000 came from. The funding that has come through state wildlife grants, while it's been significant and has led to more than $1 billion over this 20 years, is still, it's only about 60 to 70 million a year. And sorry about that. And it's not, the assumption, a survey done by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies suggested that it would take 1.3 billion a year to actually implement those state wildlife action plans fully. And again, as you all well know, state funding has really been what I call a bake sale approach. It's mostly been, aside from the funds that come from hunters and anglers, which have been very, very significant, and a variety of user fees, the rest of the funding has been through voluntary methods for the most part, like buying a license plate, income tax check off, and even some states like New Hampshire, actually people make donations to the state wildlife agency, which is like operating like a nonprofit. We've had some, some of these have generated significant funding and some raising awareness, but it's not anywhere near the level it needs to be. Iowa was in the process of, in April, and I don't know, maybe somebody on this webinar knows, but they were in the middle of passing a new sales tax. The Republican governor supported it, which would send money back into a trust that would go back for water, land, including wildlife, similar to what we've seen in Georgia most recently, and Missouri and Arkansas and Minnesota. That's a substantial level, but everything else is really on a bake sale approach, which has dramatically hindered the ability for biologists, agencies to really tackle the wildlife crisis. Because of this, we had congressional champions here, Debbie Dingell on the left from Michigan, and Mr. Jeff Fortenberry, Republican from Nebraska, who introduced a federal bill to provide states funding called Recovering America's Wildlife Act. This bill, I don't know if you're seeing the same thing on your screen. I'm sorry, if you're missing the top part, because I have this thing on here. Anyway, this bill is what we consider a once in a generation opportunity. And this idea of being able to get dedicated funding at this robust level is really a game changer for conservation. State by state, it would dramatically change the amount of money. An example of Iowa, again, aside from whether that sales tax passes or not, would go from about $625,000 a year for their so-called wildlife diversity program to 15 million. It's like on a scale that's amazing. And it would dramatically change for a state like Oregon. It's almost 1 million that they already have and they would jump to 24 million. Think of the things that you could do with that kind of funding. The funds there's also a tribal title. And this is very significant because the tribes are severely underfunded through their various mechanisms. They have nothing similar to the Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson, the user fees from hunters and anglers, and giving them the funds to manage their more than 525 federally listed species and more than 140 million acres would be a huge investment in tribal conservation efforts. And tribes have really responded by becoming a central part of the campaign on Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Here's some tribal conservationists from the Navajo Nation, and the woman on the left with the necklace works for Congresswoman Holland from New Mexico, who's one of the leaders in the Native American caucus. And so she's become, Congresswoman has become a real leader, and we're very pleased to have that. Funding, sorry about that. The funding there are certain provisions that were changed when the bill was marked up in the House in December. And now at least 15% of the funds have to be spent. So of the like 24 million that Oregon would get, at least 15% would have to go to state and federal listed endangered species. 10% would be set aside of the overall pot for competitive grants, and up to, giving it a cap, up to 15% could be used for wildlife associated recreation and education, and 25% has to be matched by the states to generate even more than this 1.3 billion. The tribes do not have a match. The funds shall, as opposed to may, be used for species of greatest conservation need and the key habitats and plant community types essential to the conservation of those species. And John will dive in more to that part. And to update the wildlife conservation plans and to help recover state and federal listed species. And that's actually important. It's not just federal species, but state. The funds would be important source for habitat conservation. That's been a huge issue, as we know, that crosses a lot of different interests, and grasslands have been a high priority. For example, for National Wildlife Federation, we work a lot on that area. We're very excited about that. And it can be used for voluntary, not just the government using the funds on their own land. Funds can be used for things that I know are very important to a lot of the work heritage programs do: survey, monitoring, and research. And it can be used in a partnership method. It's not just for an agency to keep it for themselves, but to share it as technical assistance to a variety of other public and private entities, which could be towns, land trusts, and others. It could be definitely, I know there'll be a lot of funds that go to universities, and it can be monitoring from everything from citizen science to bird observatories and others. And obviously it could be as a grant to another entity to actually buy and manage property. May be used for education, recreation, and it's also, the legislation calls out invasive species, disease, and other risks to rare species and law enforcement. This is not that it wouldn't, when it says may, it's just they were just trying to call out the importance of invasive species, but it doesn't require a state to per se do that. But we know that's a high priority. And it was also the intention to call out that species whose range overlaps with another state or country to encourage that kind of work. The recreation element is a key part of it. As you know, there's been a huge effort on state wildlife agencies to do work with hunters and anglers. This would expand that work to do much more with birders and paddlers and hikers and others. Here's an example of a big viewing area that Iowa recently built. And there's a lot of ability to help get people outdoors. The education piece would be tied to things like nature centers, the Children in Nature Network, and all kinds of work with schools, informal and formal education. And we know how important that kind of work is, and that it makes a huge difference when you start early. You can change the whole mindset of a young person as they grow up to be an adult and their stewardship ethic. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jon to give you some examples of how Georgia might spend the money, as well as to have more of an in-depth discussion about how plants, the work of plants, can be integrated into this work and how it can and should and will. So I'll turn it over to Jon. Thank you. And then I'll come back and we'll talk about the campaign. Oh, let me hit stop share, right? Is that what I do? Let me see. All right, Jon, it's yours.
All right, let's see here. I'll get this going. Here we go. Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Good. Well, thanks. It's great to be with you today. I want to talk with you a little bit about wildlife conservation from a state agency perspective and how we can expand our efforts to truly, kind of represent comprehensive wildlife conservation with enhanced funding and enhanced partnerships. So a little bit of background on my agency. The Wildlife Conservation section is one of 3 sections within Georgia DNR's Wildlife Resources Division. We have responsibility for conservation of species that are not hunted or fished for, as well as natural communities that support them. I like to say we have responsibility for the 95+% of Georgia's biological diversity. And it's important to note that in Georgia state law, wildlife is defined as native flora and fauna. And we've got a lot of native flora and fauna to keep up with and to manage. Georgia is one of the most biologically diverse states in the union, one of the fastest changing in terms of human population growth and associated impacts on natural habitats. So we're working around the state with a wide range of conservation partners to address these conservation needs. So how do we set our priorities? Well, like other state wildlife agencies, we look to the State Wildlife Action. And the official name of that is the Comprehensive Wildlife Conservation Strategy, which is a really good name, but hard to remember. So sometime in the past, we all kind of migrated to State Wildlife Action Plan as the general term. This is the plan that all states and U.S. territories develop in order to get funding through the State and Tribal Wildlife Grants Program. It's important to note that the way we look at this plan, it's the plan for our state, not the plan for our agency. That's a very important consideration. So we use the term high priority species for both plants and animals. The official term that's in the funding legislation for state and tribal wildlife grants is species of greatest conservation need. So you'll see SGCN. Every state or territory has the authority to designate its own species of greatest conservation need. And every state must review and revise as necessary their wildlife action plan within 10 years. This diagram shows kind of the hierarchy of species categories as they exist in Georgia. So the smallest circle there represents those species that are federally protected under the Endangered Species Act. The next larger circle includes our state listed species. Under state law, anything that's added to the federal list is added to the state list. So those federal species are included in our state listed species. And then the next circle is our high priority species. So those are the ones that are officially designated in Georgia's State Wildlife Action Plan. And as you can see, some of those are formally protected under state or federal law, and others are not. And then that largest circle is what we call our special concern species and natural communities. Those are all the species and natural communities that we track statewide and develop element occurrences for using biotics. So our lists of high priority species have changed over the years, and that's due to improvements in our state of knowledge of the status of these species. As you can see, just to point out a couple of examples, for mollusks, the 2005 version of the plan, we had 75 species. That went down to 57 species in our 2015 plan. And that's because we did targeted surveys for these species and found that a number of them were actually more abundant than we had thought previously. On the other hand, we didn't, in 2005, have enough consensus on priority terrestrial arthropods, so we did not include those, even though we have authority for those. But in 2015, we added 83 species of terrestrial arthropods. So that's up to each state to do that type of work. The problem is that species, as you know, don't pay much attention to state boundaries. So if we're really going to move the needle on conservation of biodiversity, we need to think bigger in terms of geography and ecosystems and ask the question, what are the most important species and sites, for example, in the Southeast for conservation action? So one approach to that is the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or CCAS, which is a conservation initiative that spans 15 states and 2 territories in the Southeast. it grew out of a realization really that we need to focus on large-scale threats like urbanization and climate change that affect entire suites of species. One of the products of that initiative is the Southeast Conservation Blueprint that tries to identify lands and waters that have high conservation value. And that's based on data from a variety of different assessments, where, as you can see here, we're currently at the 4th version of the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. We've been working at this since 2016. So basically a version comes out about every year. And the goal is to refine this over time to, with more information, updated information, more accurate data that really help us pinpoint those specific areas that are priorities for conservation. So that's the geographic component, but what about the species component? The southeastern states collectively in their wildlife action plans identified nearly 6,700 species of greatest conservation need. So how do we pare that down to a more reasonable list that states can work on across state boundaries? In 2018, we actually undertook a project to do just that with funding from the National Wildlife Federation, Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Geologic Survey, and the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Commission. And we adapted a methodology that had been used in the northeastern states several years earlier. But the goal was to develop a list of species that were considered the highest conservation priorities in the Southeast based on input from all 15 participating states. We actually identified 2 groups of priority species, highly imperiled narrow endemics and priority species for which 2 or more states share primary conservation responsibility. So these are species that occur in the Southeast primarily or solely. So we have the primary responsibility for managing those. The project took a little over a year to complete. The results are shown in this table. So we did not include plants in this particular assessment, and the reason was not all states in the Southeast currently have plants listed formally as species of greatest conservation need in their wildlife action plans. We also didn't include some invertebrate groups because we just didn't have enough information consistently throughout the Southeast on those species. So we did include all the vertebrate groups plus crayfishes, mussels, and bumblebees. And as you can see, we narrowed that list of several thousand species down to a total of 960, 293 of which were considered a very high concern within the Southeast. So this map just shows the distribution of those species of greatest conservation need in the Southeast. You can see that Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee stand out as important states in terms of the number of species. And that's primarily due to the fact that a lot of these species were aquatic species that are considered imperiled. So those 3 states are considered, as you know, hotspots for aquatic biological diversity. So fishes, mussels, other mollusks, and crayfishes. So going forward, this list will help inform the annual work plan at the regional level for the Wildlife Diversity Committee. It will guide state actions on listed and petitioned species. It will help inform the Southeast Conservation Blueprint and facilitate the development of competitive multi-state grants that we hope to get to do this work, this conservation work at a regional scale. And again, we would like to do the same thing, follow this procedure to identify priority plants within the Southeast. So one of the issues that's come up is how plants are actually treated as conservation targets by state wildlife agencies. In January, we conducted a quick poll of states and territories to get a sense of how wildlife agencies were addressing plant conservation needs. So we got 48 responses, 47 states and 1 territory. The reason that there are question marks there is one of the states did not identify, they were anonymous. So I don't know whether they just forgot to fill out a portion of the poll, or they were exactly what they were doing. So we did have a good response, is the bottom line. And it's interesting to look at what the states had to say. So these are representatives of state wildlife agencies across the country. Of the respondents, 16 said that they currently include plants in the Wildlife Action Plan in a species of greatest conservation need list. The total numbers nationally are right now are 16 states and 3 territories. We asked the question, if not, if you don't have plants in your wildlife action plans, will you include them in the future? And 9 states said they intended to include them in the next round, meaning their next revision of their wildlife action plan. For those states that did not intend to include plants in the next version of their wildlife action plan, the primary reasons given are no statutory authority and or a lack of capacity, which basically translates to lack of funding, lack of staff that have the expertise to do that work within the agency. The interesting thing was when we asked the question, what do you think the impact of Recovering America's Wildlife Act will be on plant conservation? Nearly 90% of the respondents said that there would be a positive impact on plant conservation, regardless of whether they had formally included plants in their wildlife action plan. And that's because a lot of states are doing work that benefits plants by conserving habitats, acquiring land, managing land for habitat restoration. And as you know, a lot of these priority plant species are associated with some of the animal SGCN species. So as Naomi, we have good funding in place to deal with game animals and sport fish. When it comes to endangered species, things that are on the federal list, we have annual funding that's available through Fish and Wildlife Service, through NOAA, but that has to be appropriated by Congress every year. We have annual funding that's available through the state and tribal wildlife grants for implementation of wildlife action plans. That has to be appropriated every year. There's no dedicated long-term funding for conservation of the vast majority of rare and declining species in the United States. So as Naomi mentioned, all of these things, are benefits to us. The lower match, 25% match requirement under Recovering America's Wildlife Act versus 35%, which we have in place right now for state and tribal wildlife grants. But if you look at the left-hand side of this screen, the first 5 bullets there represent activities that are currently eligible for funding under state and tribal wildlife grants. Recovering America's Wildlife Act adds those 3 items in red at the bottom. So we can do conservation education, we can do wildlife-related recreation, we can do law enforcement, again, expanding the opportunities for conservation within the state. The ability to take 10% of the national funding to put it in a competitive grant program, that would be a huge benefit for those types of species that occur across several states and for states that want to do those multi-state conservation programs. So in the final analysis, what does Recovering America's Wildlife Act mean for plant conservation? Well, as some have noted, the definition of wildlife in the Act is essentially the same as the definition in the funding legislation for state and tribal wildlife grants, in that it defines wildlife as animal species. But as Naomi mentioned, the language in the bill identifies plant communities as conservation targets. And again, many states currently are using state and tribal wildlife grants, and as well as other funding sources for plant conservation. They look, forward to having those additional resources to expand that portion of the conservation portfolio. But it's going to require some communication and collaboration and some creativity on the part of both the wildlife agencies and the conservation partners. Rick has mentioned several times in the past that when he worked at the Natural Heritage Program, he was able to use state and tribal wildlife grants to construct a greenhouse. And I don't believe he served any jail time for that. So he was very successful. So you have to be creative. You have to have partners that can, in some cases, work in areas where you don't have statutory authority or may not have the staff expertise to delve into a particular area. And the last point I want to make, a lot of this is going to depend on the implementation guidance provided by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's going to be an important factor. We want that guidance language to be flexible and broad to allow us to do more work on plant conservation in the future at all scales and in all areas. So that's my presentation. Do you want to take questions now, or do we want to?
We're running a little short time. We have one question. Well, actually, two questions came in on the chat line. One said, so I'll just do these two questions now, then we'll go back to Naomi, and then if there's time at the end, we'll follow with more questions. But one question came in, said that could the 15% allocated to the state and federal listed species be used specifically to work on state listed plant species? And Naomi said, yes, we believe so. And then the other question that came in, or that hadn't got answered, was, does the bill or grant program have incentives for states that didn't include plants in the previous plans to add them?
Not that I know of. I mean, the incentives would really come from the ability, and some states are going to find it hard to actually come up with the match for the federal funds. So partners that can come in, that can do work in areas where the state wildlife agency doesn't have staff, doesn't have other resources. Obviously they can help provide the match for those federal funds. And that can include data projects. It can include, field research projects and survey projects, really across the board. Okay, again, if you have any more questions, type them into the chat area and we'll try to get those at the end. So Naomi, can you pick it back up for the last bit?
Yes. Great. Hold on, sorry. Let me just get myself. I'm in kind of the right area, but.
Rick, can you just read the questions, Naomi?
No, we've answered the questions that have come up so far, so we're going to wait till she's done with her last part and then take any more questions that came in.
Here we go. Thanks. All right, I just wanted to get in the right spot. So I'm going to thank you for doing that, John, and I'm going to share with you some quickly. I'm going to go through the campaign, and so that you can see what we're doing. So the campaign has three main elements: to elevate the crisis, secure bill passage, and build the conservation army. And this is, whoops. Working to is it not? I'm sorry, I'm having, it won't let me go to the next slide. Here we go. So one simple thing we're doing is just getting attention on the Hill by bringing the wildlife to the Hill. And we did a whole effort around the monarch butterfly and bringing that on Valentine's Day and saying, hey, instead of will you be my Valentine, we were like, will you be my co-sponsor? And it was a lot of fun. And we also recently brought bald eagles around as a success story and got to meet a lot of members of Congress. You'd be surprised. It's not real wildlife. Like Rick said, I did bring a bald eagle, real live one, around the Hill many times and with great success, but we brought the stuffed animals and it was almost equally successful. So that's a fun little way to get people's attention. So focusing on the bill, actual passage of the bill, the plan in the House where the bill's been introduced was a co-sponsor drive where we had the hearing and then the committee, very successful bipartisan committee vote late in the year, last year. And we were aiming for a floor vote in 2020, even in March or April. We ended at, right before the virus closed things down, we ended up with 180 bipartisan co-sponsors. It's an amazing list of co-sponsors, really, truly amazing, the breadth of it. And we believe we saw this support simply because it's good for wildlife, good for taxpayers, and good for business under the premise, again, of a proactive effort, costs less, saves wildlife, and therefore it ends up becoming good for business, who can sometimes, it stalls business when you end up with an endangered species. So we were able to get a lot of support from even unlikely allies within the Republican Party, which has been great. The Senate bill, which we've been working to get the right bipartisan mix, but haven't quite gotten there yet, would go through the Environment and Public Works Committee, where a lot of people are poised to help us, but we don't yet have the bill introduced. And then we came up, of course, ran into, which we all know and are not happy about, and of course, and we're very saddened by the loss of lives and the economic disruption and others. My husband just learned of somebody he knew who passed away in New York yesterday. So we recognize the reality of the situation, and it's basically without being, again, recognizing the health issues, it's also been a huge economic problem. And as you know, there's been several packages going through the Congress related to the recovery of the economy. We do see an opportunity here, whereas we know there's a lot of good data on nature being the economic driver. And for example, the outdoor industry shows that there's 7.6 million American jobs tied to it, and that the numbers say that for every dollar invested in conservation work, you can get more than double back. There is work going on right now to see about getting a restoration and resilience title in a future economic stimulus package. And we are really working closely with some leaders on the Democrat side to see that happen. We also, the third piece of this is about building the conservation army, which is a huge aspect and one where we would love some people's help. Again, National Wildlife Federation was founded by Ding Darling, and he had a big vision that the way we need to get conservation done is bring all the players together and work together. And sometimes that happens, but much of the time, unfortunately, it doesn't. And you'll see here, it has garden clubs on this, sportsmen, soil conservation people, 4-H clubs, and so on. And it's that idea, if we really do work together, we can have an impact. And so we are in the process of building that conservation army, including birders and gardeners and hikers and paddlers and businesses. And gardeners are a huge part of the outdoor economy. There's the native plant industry has become very big, and it's something that, hold on. And this is an example of putting in native plants on my synagogue grounds. Oops. And of course, we know hunters and anglers have been a big part of the Conservation Army and are really very much active players in this effort. Nature photographers, we're doing a big outreach to them to get them to help let Congress know how important this bill is. They're some of the people seeing the declines of wildlife firsthand. And there's birders, and there's hikers, like we said, and not just, and that's families and elders. And one of the ways we're showing this is through a sign-on letter, which NatureServe and many others, more than 1,000 organizations and business have signed on saying we believe in this need for this kind of funding. So again, I'll run through this very quickly. There's many ways you as an individual could help. You can contact your own members of Congress, and I'm going to give you some caveats when we get to the question and answers. But you can not just be the one to contact your own member, but you could ask your family, your friends, and your colleagues. Here's an example of me talking to Congressman Raskin, my congressman. He's been a great co-sponsor, and he just got assigned to the Democrats. He's in the leadership, and he's assigned to the economic recovery oversight. So I think he'll be an ally for us in this. And we have on, National Wildlife Federation is a major advocacy organization, and we have action alerts on our website. If you go to the Recovering America's Wildlife section, there's a pre-populated one, you can change it, you can make your own, and as long as you put in your address with your zip code, it'll tell you who your own member of Congress is. So these are the kinds of things, obviously there's social media. We're doing a ton of social media on this, and we'll be doing a lot more a lot more, period. If you would like to get regular updates directly from me on the bill, just take my email and send it to me, and I'll be putting more of them out more regularly, and you can stay up to date individually. The website, again, nwf.org, Recovering America's Wildlife, has tons, has some good information on it. We're adding more, and just want to say that, while the crisis is very severe, we do know that we have had lots of successes in the community, and we can do much more. And that this is an ambitious bill, but we need it to be ambitious because the problem is really significant. And it does take persistence, which some of us have been at this for many, many times, and it takes action. And if we don't speak up, we won't have a change in how conservation is funded. And we know, as one of the leaders in our era right now for conservation, how Greta really made a difference. One person made a huge difference, and this translated into, here's an example of my son's school getting the day off to go to Congress about the climate crisis, and they completely approved it when he requested it. And there's an understanding that the youth have a lot to say, and she made a huge difference in infusing the conservation movement with a lot of energy. And at this same rally, we saw that people were paying attention to that science article. And we think that the country, while we're in the midst of this situation right now, we know more and more people are going outdoors, and people love the outdoors, and nature is providing not just jobs, which it will in the recovery, but real emotional, help and healing from this awful tragedy and pandemic that we're in. So I will stop here, but thank you so much for listening to all of this, and I look forward to having some, answering some questions and following people individually.
Okay, thanks, Naomi. I've got a couple questions, and then maybe Allison, you cut us off and we need to be cut off. But we had two questions that concerned the funding source for WAWA. Formerly it was, I think, Outer Continental Shelf oil and gas revenues, and that's changed. And what's the current funding source?
That was, so there were quite a few changes made, or some changes made during the markup with the House Natural Resource Committee. And one of them was, because of the climate crisis, the Democrats saying you have to not be tied to fossil fuels, even, of course, like Land and Water Conservation Fund is. And so the idea was to put money back into conservation from the damage of lands and waters. But in this case, they felt like that was not appropriate anymore. And so it doesn't have a particular source. It is just tied to the so-called treasury, which is wherever the money comes from. So it's not, doesn't have a, so it's basically wherever money comes in from the treasury, which is a mishmash, but includes income taxes, and fees from other things. It goes into a big pot, and they would just dedicate it for this purpose.
Okay, another question says, for the 85% not allocated to listed species, are there requirements or incentives to address the vast majority of species? Can it all be applied solely to the same game species that have gotten most of the attention to date?
Well, do you want to answer it, John? I can answer it, but I'm happy to turn that one over to you.
Well, you know, it's true that some states do have game species currently on their SGCN lists. It's usually a very small number. You know, we have the northern bobwhite on our list, but that's because it's a, you know, it is a species in decline, and it's, you know, it's an indicator species for pine savannas. I don't see that as an immediate threat. It's something that, you know, I think all conservation partners need to think about, though, and I think, you know, each state needs to be inclusive. You know, we had 100 organizations that provided input into our wildlife action plan, so we got a lot of great, you know, input that was reflected in the plan and in the revision of the plan. So it really has to do with how the state wildlife agency views its partners, and you know, I think again, with this level of funding, there will be a great opportunity and a great need to share the work. You know, hopefully every state looks at their wildlife action plan as the plan for their state, not their agency.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. There's some accountability in the bill where states have to every year provide to Congress what they're doing with the money, and that this is where people have to show up at commission meetings and give input into the state wildlife action plans and so on. But I think, again, it's run by what's in the state wildlife action plan. So I think that I am assuming things will go well, but it's our job as citizens to speak up and make sure.
Okay, here's a question. Oh, go ahead, Edelson.
We are a little over, and I want to be cognizant of people's time. Rick, do you want to do one more question, and then we will take all the unanswered questions, and we will have Jon and Naomi answer them, and we can circulate those answers by email.
Okay, sounds good. This is a question that's probably on a lot of people's minds. With the current recession and increasing federal deficit caused by the coronavirus, how do you anticipate it will affect passage of RAWA?
Wait, can you repeat that? Sorry.
So we just went $4 trillion in debt in the federal government. There's red ink everywhere.
Yeah.
How do you think that's going to affect passage of RAWA?
Yeah, I was looking at one of the other questions. Sorry, I was trying to answer them at the same time. So I think that, I mean, frankly, I think this economic stimulus package, if we can get this restoration and resilience title, that'll be our best bet. I think that it is going to, you know, put a damper on it, unfortunately, because we were really full steam ahead, and just like 9/11 actually did way back when. But I think that we will, you know, we have a lot of support in leadership, and I think that we have to really just make the economic case. It's not just about the wildlife now, but about the economy and the jobs, and we have very good data for that. So we have to, you know, use those data to really make our point. And I think if we can get something in that package, we'll be in, actually, it'll be good. It'll be really helpful. So we'll have to see, but that package may take its time too. So we can't go away, but we are working delicately with Congress right now. I will say that we're not doing full speed ahead on individual co-sponsors. We're doing gentle, we're calling like more gentle asks. And we want to be cognizant of the fact that they're really trying to take care of some, you know, real problems the nation has, but we don't want wildlife lost in that either. And I just want to say hi, Eric. Hi, Eric Sorensen.
Okay, Naomi, or Allison, did you want to wrap up with anything?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So as I mentioned before, there'll be a recording that will circulate when it's ready. We'll also ask Naomi and Jon to provide just some information for any questions we didn't get to. And we'll circulate that as well. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Jon. Thank you, Naomi, for the wonderful presentation, very informative. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it.